So we're getting ready to leave the tiny house to go to the tiny house festival. Oh, and we have a visitor. The Swan came to say hi. Originally we were going to take the motorcycle, but it's kind of cloudy today and I think it's supposed to thunder later. And it's been kind of a busy week, so we're a little tired. We try not to go on the motorcycle when we're both feeling pretty tired, so we're going to take the truck, which makes packing easier. We're just throwing the camping bins from the outside into the back of the truck, and then we're going to be ready to go. This is our 24-foot tiny house on wheels. At this point, we've been living in it for a little over a year, and one of the reasons we wanted to go to the Tiny House Festival was because our builder, Bob from Titan Tiny Houses, was going to be there. He was going to be doing a talk. There was an option to camp at the Tiny House Festival, but we really wanted to get some hiking in, so we decided to stay at Stokes State Forest. Pat had been there when he was a kid, and it was actually pretty close to where I grew up in North Jersey. The drive from South Jersey up to Stokes should have taken about 2.5 to 3 hours, but we hit a lot of traffic, and we ended up getting to the park when it was just getting dark. Now, if you've ever been to Stokes, it's kind of confusing. The ranger station is in the middle, and then the road behind the ranger station does not go to the Mill Campground, so we were driving around for over an hour trying to figure it out. So if you ever find yourself at Stokes and you're going to Mill, you actually have to leave the ranger station and go out around the side of the park and then to the back. This is the tent.
Yeah, that's the bottom.
Poles. Okay, ground cloth.
Yeah.
And then that's the rain fly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Setting up camp after it's dark is always a little bit more difficult. But luckily, we brought our Kelty Stargazer tent on this trip, which is a pretty easy tent to set up, and we've used it multiple times on different trips, so we kind of had the hang of it already. But it was still more difficult to try to put everything together by headlamp. Good morning. So we got to the campsite really late. Well, not really late, but after 9, so it was dark last night, which made it a lot more difficult to get set up and kind of get our bearings and figure out where the bathroom is. But we figured all that out. But here's our tent. It's not too bad to set it up at night. Got our chairs underneath there because it's been raining on and off for most of the morning. Just real light rain. And then we had our first day playing with the BioLite this morning, which was rather challenging, especially because we were working with all wet sticks, but we were successful in making coffee. Our first time using the BioLite camp stove was really a little bit of a challenge. The sticks were wet because it was rainy, but it was still kind of a high maintenance process. We had to constantly keep putting sticks into the stove, and you have to take the pan off the top in order to get the water hot enough to boil so that we could make our mountain house. But after a slow start to the day, we headed over to the Sussex County Fairgrounds to see what was going on at the Tiny House Festival. Wow, there's a lot of cars here.
It's busy.
I was hoping because it was raining that it wouldn't be as busy today.
Maybe this is really taking off more than we thought.
Yeah. Everybody's curious.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I see the Titan house.
Yeah.
That looks like our house. Oh, no, maybe not. I don't know. Yeah. It looks very similar to our house. The fairgrounds were organized into different sections. There was one section of companies that were advertising their tiny house builds. There was another section of campers and Airstreams and school buses and smaller do-it-yourself tiny houses. And then, of course, there was an area of food trucks so that you could get something to eat. But we had to make a stop at the Tiny House Coffee Bar. And then we headed over to the vintage campers, which were absolutely adorable. These reminded me of my original trailer, which was a 1977 holiday rambler called Free Spirit. That was what started me on this tiny house journey and gave me my first experience living in a small space. Next we headed over to the school bus conversions, which were still in progress. Oh, is it?
One of those special hinges that go up. and it comes with a workstation.
Awesome.
This is my bathtub right here.
Oh, it's just a oh wow.
That's the bathtub. It's gonna have the curtain track like in the hospital. Okay. It'll be open when it's not used, and then it also is gonna be a seating tabletop or lift up. You see those coffee tables that lift up? It's gonna have those hinges on there, and it lines up to this. And then it extends by counter.
That's cool.
Finally.
It's all
cool.
a separate thing.
It feels big. The slide out takes the world of difference. And I don't like confined spaces, so I intentionally kept this to a minimum. Just to leave like open air. I didn't want a kitchen table, even though it's only this big, but to be crowded. The slide out.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Definitely the way to go.
You go on this one? Oh, it's an incinerating toilet.
Yeah.
Fancy.
Oh, cool. It's a good one.
Yeah.
Really good word. Yeah.
It's nice. I like the bathroom.
The layout and everything.
And you can have a gas.
Yeah.
I think it's an infrared heater. I'm not sure.
Oh, if you want storage.
Yeah.
Cool.
This was my favorite tiny house of the festival. It was a very small house, but it was full of all these really unique personal touches. The gentleman sitting out front had built it himself, and it was so unique, and you could tell that he really put a lot of thought into every little thing that was in this space.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
What's that?
Some days not a day of the week. I like that.
That's a good one.
Did you guys get to see anything else?
The next tiny house was built on a cargo trailer with a drop-down ramp to get inside. And this one was built by a husband and wife team. You could tell that they put a ton of work into the craftsmanship. There were really high-end finishings, beautiful woodwork, and it was a very efficient layout for the space.
Yeah.
Same fridge we have.
Yeah. Cool.
Composting toilet. No, it's a cartridge toilet.
Oh, it's okay.
The last tiny house in this row was kind of a Victorian or Gothic inspired tiny house. And this was actually the lady who organized this event. This tiny house had a lot of decorative elements in it. You could tell that it was not used for full-time living. You can see the old sewing machine and the potbelly stove, but not a lot of living space. So it's really more of a showpiece. How are you? Good, how are you? I'm great. What are you doing? Good, how are you? Very well. So adorable. Look at the dog. Toward the front of the fairgrounds, we went to the commercial builders. And they actually had a steel frame set up, which was interesting because this is what the inside of our tiny house looks like, but we never got to see it in this stage. This is lower than ours.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, no.
Close, because I can reach the ceiling.
Yeah.
Underneath. We went up to check out the commercially built tiny houses, and there was one house in particular that we wanted to make sure that we got to see. It was the house from Chattanooga Tiny Houses, because this was one of the builders we had talked to originally when we were trying to find a builder for our house. And they were a little bit out of our price range, so we ended up going with Titan, but we wanted to see what kind of house they brought to the festival. We went over to the food trucks to get some lunch, and then our last stop was this tumbleweed tiny house from Siesta Key Tiny Houses. You can actually go down to Florida and rent one of these for the weekend or for a week for your stay in Florida. So it was neat to see that tiny houses are becoming commercially used.
That was 75. Shower was
I just wanted to. A lot of them have this little like nook.
It's cool.
Look, it's like this is
Yeah. For kids or something, that's
Yeah.
cool. Especially if this is like the vacation ones.
Yeah.
Oh Lord.
We went to the Tiny House Festival at the Sussex Fairgrounds today, and that was a really interesting experience. It was,
More than I thought.
I mean, for us, our tiny house is the only one that we have ever seen in person besides the other one that just got delivered to our resort,
Our neighbor, yeah.
which I haven't even been inside of. So today was the
It's a nice unit.
second tiny house that I've ever been inside of. So that was interesting, and of course the layouts are totally different. You get to see all sorts of sizes and varieties of tiny house. Some of them were, oh, getting smoky.
Yeah.
Some of them were gooseneck trailers. Some of them were almost set up like toy haulers. There was a Victorian tiny house, so it was a big variety and totally different from what we're used to in our tiny house. But it was really neat to just be around the tiny house community and people who understand what a tiny house is, because most of the time we're always stuck explaining to people or showing them pictures of exactly what the tiny house looks like. So it's nice to be around people who are in the world and know what it's about, and you don't have to sell them on it because they already get it.
Yeah. That's 90% of the conversations out there.
Yeah. But it was really neat. We got to, we saw our builder, Bob, today, and we got to talk to him for a little while, which is great.
Yeah.
And just kind of hear how things are going with the business and
Titan Tiny Homes.
Titan Tiny Homes. Yeah. They're in Chicago. So it's good to see that the Tiny House Festival is kind of coming to the Northeast, because this is an area where for us over a year and a half ago when we were trying to find a house builder, there was nobody in this area. So we're hoping that there's a growing interest in tiny houses and hopefully more builders, and with that hopefully more opportunities or availability for places to park your tiny house. That's really the most difficult thing when you have a tiny house, is finding somewhere to park it. So hopefully as the awareness increases, people will be more willing to let tiny housers use their land, park in their driveways, whatever is going to work. But I think after seeing all the different tiny houses today and all of the layouts, that our house is still my favorite layout in terms of just being functional. We have a huge amount of open floor space. We can have both of us in the kitchen and cook, and it doesn't feel cramped. It's a very effective, simple design that after living in the house for over a year, I wouldn't change it at all. So I think
And again, the fancier you go, the cuter it is, the more weight, the more cost, the more experimental it's going to be, because the builders aren't. It's very custom. Everything, especially right now, is super custom. So you are pretty much the experiment. So if you can keep it simple as possible and functional, you're going to be a lot better off with your design in a tiny house.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say for the simplicity of the design. When you start to get really fancy with things, it can kind of clutter the area up, and you definitely don't want that.
Takes away headspace.
Yeah.
Drag if you're trailing it.
For a lot of the houses that we were in today, I mean, of course, when you're at the festival, there's like 10 people trying to cram into a tiny house at one time, but I felt like a lot of the floor plans were very cramped. And I know even for us, when we've had people come over, we've had, I think we've had 8 people in the house at once, and you could still move around, and you could get to the bathroom or get into the kitchen if you needed to without having to climb over anybody. So some of the designs that we saw today were really, the hallways were so narrow that you were just bumping into the other people that you were trying to move around, which we haven't found at all in our house, which is nice.